Good morning, afternoon, evening everyone, and welcome back to the Genshin Impact character review series where we take a look at each character, review them, and I give my opinions on them. Today's character is Childe, or Tartaglia, or Tortelini, or Tartar sauce as I like to call him. He has so many names, and people really like to meme about them. So, Childe, as I'm gonna call him throughout the whole video, he is extremely good. An extremely good DPS, as a first opinion, and he's very, very fun to play, I must say. He has a very unique gameplay style, so yeah, let's get into his kit, because there's a lot to say about Childe and what he does. So then, let's start off with his auto attacks. Childe's auto attacks are very much nothing unique. He's a bow user, so tapping the attack button does these multiple arrow strikes. He does have one extra bow attack compared to some other bow users, where he just snaps the bow and does actually a shot that reaches further than other shots. So hey, that's interesting. And of course, he has his charged attack shots, where if you wait for a bit of a second, they will get infused with hydro, and then you'll be able to shoot enemies. So the thing is that Childe, in his normal attacks, has Riptide. Now, what is Riptide? So whenever you use a fully charged shot and you hit an enemy, you apply Riptide to them. Now, if you shoot another charged shot to a Riptide affected enemy, you will, alongside the normal charge shot, you will also deal little slashes of hydro damage to the target and its surrounding targets. Those deal a good amount of damage, and if the target dies while having the Riptide effect on them, they will deal a massive slash of hydro and close to them that will apply a Riptide to other enemies and deal a very good amount of damage. It is very complicated, and to be honest, even me explaining these things, you might get confused. So just go on in the game, or in a character profile sort of page or something, and sit down and read what the thing does, because again, it's very complicated. But as a good quick recap, charged shots apply Riptide, other charged shots trigger Riptide that deals extra hydro damage to the enemy and enemies close to it, and if the target dies while they have Riptide on, they will deal a lot of damage to surrounding enemies and also apply Riptide to those enemies that were hit. So yeah, with this thing, Childe can get some insane chain reactions, especially with the death effect. If there are 2-3 enemies that are low on HP and you kill one, you can easily trigger a chain reaction where one dies. They trigger this Riptide blast, as it's called. Then another target dies, and they also trigger Riptide blast. Then another target dies, and it's so much damage. Like, the death damage of Riptide it's a lot. So yeah, again, Riptide is very it's his meat of his kit, a very main focus that Childe has. And yeah, I mean, it also follows, Riptide also follows Childe throughout his whole kit. And yeah, I mean, we gotta talk about it, and again, it's very complicated. So then let's move on to Childe's elemental skill. So Childe's elemental skill is a stance change, as it's called, where Childe becomes a melee user instead of a bow user. So Childe changes stances. He now has his 2 hydro daggers, and he attacks very, very quickly. So yeah, these hydro swords or hydro daggers, they apply hydro to enemies, and because of how fast Childe attacks, you have such fast hydro application and some really good damage. And also, whenever you hit an enemy with these hydro swords that has Riptide on them, you will trigger a Riptide slash, and that will deal the charged attack effect, so that will deal some extra slashes of hydro damage to the target and its surrounding enemies. This also counts as elemental skill damage and can also only trigger every 1.5 seconds. So, hitting a target continuously won't trigger these slashes back to back to back. There's a bit of a cooldown to that extra damage. The main thing that people, complain about Childe and this ability is that it has a long cooldown. Now, its cooldown is weird, actually. Believe it or not, even the cooldown is weird on this skill. So, the cooldown has a minimum of 6 seconds. So you activate the skill and then you can reactivate it to switch back. It has a minimum cooldown of 6 seconds and a maximum of 45 seconds. Now, how do you reach that 45 seconds cooldown? Well, the cooldown increases the more you stay in that melee stance. So, with the base cooldown of 6 seconds, if you stay in melee for 4 seconds, there's gonna be a 10 seconds cooldown. So yeah, people complain that Childe has a really high cooldown because of this skill, but here is the thing. By playing with Childe and using Childe, you will easily just learn how much time you need to spend in his melee form, and then you have to switch back. It literally becomes muscle memory, where what you need to do with Childe while you are in melee stance just becomes so automatic on your hands. Like, again, muscle memory. It's not even like a sort of like paying attention to a clock to count the seconds or anything. It's literally muscle memory, where your hands will automatically just press the button again to switch back, and you'll easily get a feeling inside of you that, okay, this is enough time that I've been in melee form, time to switch back. Like, it literally becomes mental and muscle memory. And that's what it is. It's just experience with Childe, and you'll easily learn to control the cooldown. The max amount of time that people spend with Childe in melee form is like 6 to 8 seconds, and that's max, because again, the base cooldown of 6, add around 8 to 10 seconds on that's 16 seconds of a cooldown, and that's perfectly fine for a skill, and especially for this skill. Like, the melee stance is really, really powerful. Something that I didn't mention is that whenever you change your stance to melee, you do trigger a bit of damage that actually does deal a good amount of damage whenever you change your stance. But yeah, the second Ascension talent also allows your crit hits whenever you are in melee stance to apply the Riptide effect to enemies, so you don't need to do charged shots to apply Riptide to enemies. You just switch to your melee stance, you start attacking, you trigger a crit hit on an enemy, and they get Riptide. You also trigger the effect, of course, because you're attacking in melee stance, and yeah, it's just a chain reaction of effects, that you just need to learn. Again, experience with Childe is the only thing you need, and then everything becomes memory and everything becomes automatic. And yeah, I mean, that's it. It's really good damage. Childe does have a hydro damage ascension stat. It's a bit hard to balance his crit rate and crit damage, but this hydro damage does help him deal more damage while at melee stance. He does need that hydro damage because, again, all of his damage through melee in his melee stance is hydro, and you can't do anything about that. So it's, the hydro damage ascension stat is welcome, but it does make balancing crit damage and crit rate a bit of a pain. So you do need a bit of a good artifacts for Childe. Then we get on to his bursts. Yes, he has two bursts. So Childe's burst changes if he is in melee form or ranged form. So while he's in ranged form, he will supposedly shoot an arrow, and when it contacts an enemy, it will explode, deal hydro damage to an area, deal a lot of hydro damage to an area, and then it will apply the Riptide status effect on enemies, and then it will also generate back 20 energy to Childe. Childe's burst energy cost is 60, and then the ranged burst gives you back around 20, I think, 25% of that, which equals to 20 energy. You can't increase that, by the way, with energy recharge. It's just a refund value. It's not particles coming towards you. And then his melee burst, he does a huge slash with his weapon, spear sort of hydro weapon, and then he deals more damage than the ranged stance. And then if enemies have Riptide applied on them, he will trigger a Riptide blast slash. There's so many names, but he will trigger the Riptide effect, cleanse it off of enemies, so he will remove it from enemies, but he will deal extra damage. That Riptide blast effect will deal extra damage, just like everything else does when it hits Riptide. But the ult will cleanse the effect from enemies, so you will need to reapply it to them. And also, when you use the melee burst, you don't get any energy back. So both ults are fine. One deals more damage, the other one applies a Riptide and gives you some energy back. Most people will tell you, oh, never use the melee burst, the energy is too good. But in my opinion, and with my experiences with Childe, both bursts are perfectly fine to use. If you don't want to switch to melee in order to activate the melee burst, just use the ranged one. Again, you'll deal less damage, but you will get the energy back. But if you care about dealing damage and just destroying all of the enemies, just switch to melee, start attacking, and then use the burst after you have applied the Riptide effect to most of the enemies. And then you'll deal a lot of damage through the burst on its own. Then the Riptide will trigger. It's crazy. But again, if you want more damage, use the melee one. If you want that energy, use the ranged one. And I've seen some people say like, oh, the energy is too good to pass up. It's not really. The amount of hydro damage and particles that Childe can generate through Riptide, through just killing enemies and through hitting enemies with the hydro swords, it's just enough. And especially again, he's a very high DPS character that really works against groups of enemies. He's still good against bosses and single enemies, but just add one more enemy so that Childe can trigger chain reactions, and Childe will just destroy them and melt them, and he'll kill them. So he'll get energy particles for him. So again, still, the ranged ultimate, the energy you get back from it is a nice bonus, but it isn't that great of a bonus to say that the melee burst is useless. Just use what burst you feel is necessary at that moment. I usually just use the melee burst, but if you want to, trigger Vaporize, if enemies are affected by Pyro, it's easier to just use the ranged burst, because if you switch too close to these enemies, you will apply Hydro to them, because the stance change does trigger a Hydro attack. So, be careful to switch away and then come back and trigger Vaporize. And not only that, if the enemy is affected by Pyro and you want to apply Riptide to them, well, you can't really do that. If you do a charge shot, you will trigger Vaporize. If you hit with your Hydro swords, you will trigger Vaporize again. So unfortunately, in order to use the melee burst, you can really trigger Vaporize with it and trigger the Riptide blast that accompanies it. So again, for a more Vaporize comp, that Childe triggers the Vaporize, then the ranged burst is, preferred. But again, there is no problem with using any of the two bursts. And if someone tells you one is better than the other and just use only one, then shoot him down. Just ignore that. Both bursts are good, and most likely you will see that in your time using Childe, you will use one or the other at some point. Again, depends on the situation and what you want to do. Deal more damage, save some energy, again, or apply the Riptide effect. Again, the ranged burst does apply Riptide effect to many enemies. But if the enemies are already affected, why not use the melee burst? Like, again, situations are there, and every situation wants a different burst. So again, you'll understand it. Again, it's all about experience. So why don't we get to roles? Of course, we saw Childe's kit. What are his roles? Well, Childe is usually used as a secondary main DPS, not a sub DPS, a secondary main DPS, another main DPS that appears on the field after you have used your other supporting abilities, and then he appears on the field to switch to melee form, start destroying enemies for 6, 8, 10 seconds, switch back to ranged form, and then disappear until the cooldown is back over. Like that's what you do. So having some other main DPS that has lower cooldowns than Childe is a very good option to have in your party. Some examples are Keqing with her low cooldown skill, Diluc also works. Like there are a lot of other main DPSs that have low cooldown skills or that don't depend on their bursts to deal damage. Like someone like Xiao does go along with Childe, but if you use Xiao's dashes and his burst, he also needs to wait for cooldowns. So he also needs to disappear like Childe. So, try to find another main DPS that you're gonna be using while Childe is on cooldown. And that's how it is. Again, he's a secondary main DPS. Yes, you can use him as a sort of like burst sub DPS, where he only appears to just throw out the burst and then disappear, maybe deal some damage through the hydro hits. But yeah, like I've seen some people say, oh, he's a good sub burst DPS, but I'm like, but if you use him as a sub burst DPS, like, aren't you ignoring basically everything else except for the burst? And that's not really nice to just have to use like not even 30% of a character. This doesn't sound nice. So yeah. And of course he's preferred on his like preferred environment is where there's a lot of enemies that can easily be grouped up. So if you have someone like Sucrose, Venti, Kazuha, they can easily group up enemies and then Childe will delete them. I don't think there's a character that can delete enemies like Childe if they are grouped up together. Yes, Ganyu and Xiao have a lot of AoE, but again, just seeing all of the Riptide going around in a group of enemies, it's so satisfying. And again, it's a lot of damage. Again, if you trigger a chain reaction of enemies dying, the Riptide damage of that death is so much, it's crazy. And there are some team comps that do exist that feed Childe a lot. There is the Childe Vaporize comp, where you have someone like Zhang Ling proccing Vaporize through something like Goba or the Pyro Tornado, and because Childe attacks so quickly with his swords, he can't really be the one triggering the Vaporize. So he acts as a secondary main DPS that deals hydro damage, and then you have Zhang Ling as the main Vaporize DPS that switches in when Childe is off cooldown and uses her abilities to vaporize while Childe is on the field. It's a bit of a weird team comp, but works very well. Childe also works on an electro-charged composition because Riptide applies so much hydro in an area, so does his normal auto attacks, and someone like Fischl, Beidou, or other electro characters apply electro as well, so you just have a group of enemies full of electro charge. You're also generating many particles, and it's called the Childe Fireworks team, and it works. You can also have a sort of Childe permafreeze. He applies hydro a lot, and if you have if you have a character that periodically can freeze enemies, apply cryo to them, that can easily work. Examples are someone like Kaeya, where the icicles from his burst will stick to Childe, and again, Childe will just be able to permafreeze enemies, and it's good to permafreeze enemies with Childe because in your normal rotation of attacks while you're using your skill, your melee stance, there will be a lot of charge attacks. It usually sort of goes like attack, 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 charge attack, dash back in, attack, 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 charge attack. And because his charge attack also has a 20 energy cost instead of 25, you will see Child players really use that charged attack. And with permafreeze, those enemies aren't going to be scattered and knocked back and then separated. So with a permafreeze comp, like again Kaeya, heck, a Chi-Chi can easily work as a permafreeze combination for Child. You'll just be able to permafreeze enemies, keep them in place while Child shreds them. And a good example is the Geovis Haps on floor 12 of the Abyss. If you permafreeze them and, group them together with Child, you'll be just destroying their HP. And not only that, these bastards are very annoying, so permafreezing them is a good way to keep your party out of danger. And something that can sometimes happen, if you deal a lot of damage while permafreezing these Geovis Haps, there is a chance that once they are unfrozen, they won't switch their element. I have had this happen to me like twice, 3 times, where because I just destroyed the HP of a Geovis Hap, it just forgot to change an element, and that is only that option, that this sort of bug can only happen if you permafreeze the Geovis Hap, because the Geovis Haps work in a way where if they end their attack cycle, they will switch to their elements. A permafreeze comp easily works with Child, keeps enemies close so that you can just destroy them. The Fireworks team with Electrocharged is a very good option, and then the sort of reverse Vaporize, where Xianling triggered the Vaporize, is also a good option. Depends on the characters you have and the parties you can form, and of course the characters you want to play and the characters that you have leveled up. So yeah, as for artifacts then, the main artifact set is a 4-piece Heart of Depth. It is completely built for Child. The 2-piece increases your hydro damage bonus, and then the 4-piece increases your normal and charged attack damage when you activate your elemental skill, which is exactly what helps Child deal damage. The sub DPS, burst DPS, uses a 2-piece Heart of Depth and a 2-piece Noblesse to of course maximize your burst damage. So yeah, those are really the only sets you can use. Perhaps a 4-piece Gladiator's Finale if you're having trouble farming the Heart of Depth artifacts, but the hydro damage bonus is a bit more useful than what the Gladiator's Finale gives you. Now, the new Inazuma sets that are coming out, perhaps the Inazuma Energy Recharge set might replace the sub DPS burst DPS Child. So, instead of the 2-piece Heart, 2-piece Noblesse, you'll go a 4-piece of this Energy Recharge set to just deal a massive amount of burst damage. And I mean, again, for the sub DPS that uses the sub DPS Child that only uses his burst, then I guess this will become the new standard. But the other one, with the whole losing your energy, no, as far as I know, the extra hydro damage from Heart of Depth and its effect from the 4-piece just are just much better than this whole losing your energy to gain a bit of damage for a sort of amount of time, because Heart of Death again is just, it's made for Child. Like, the whole set was just made for him, so how can you say no? So yeah, that is it for artifact sets. Not many choices, but Child doesn't really have that much of versatility when it comes to what he can do. He's just a hydro damage dealer that shreds groups of enemies. So why don't we move to weapons then that help Child? So let's take them one by one. The stringless for a burst, again, the sub DPS burst Child, the stringless can work. It increases your elemental burst damage by a lot, gives elemental mastery, so if you trigger Vaporize with that burst, then sure. So, stringless is okay only for that burst DPS kind of Child. Alley Hunter, it isn't the worst option if you don't have anything else. It has really good base attack. It gives an attack percent, which Child is very, that's very welcome for a Child. And then the Alley Hunter's effect is that for each second that a character isn't on the field, they get increased damage output. And then when that character is on the field for more than 4 seconds, they start losing that buff. So for Child, this can easily work, because again, his cooldown is around 16 seconds if you use him for 6 to 8 seconds on the field with the melee stance. So he's gonna be out on the field for the full effect to, again, take effect, the full ally hunter effect to get that damage up, and then you switch to him, you use him for around 6 to 8 seconds, and in those 6 to 8 seconds, the effect has disappeared, and it's ready to just charge up again. So I think ally hunter is a very good choice, actually. Again, if you don't have anything else, if it's the only gacha weapon you have, ally hunter, I think, again, is a very, very good choice. Because again, Childe doesn't stay on the field for more than 8 to 10 seconds, so he's gonna maximize the usability of ally hunter. Blackcliff Warbow, very good, 44 base attack, more than other Blackcliff weapons, and of course it gives crit damage. So again, with Childe having a hydro damage ascension stat, it is hard to balance out his crit damage and crit rate. So using a weapon that gives him crit damage or crit rate will easily help you balance out crit damage and crit rate stats. Its effect as well is very good, since Childe will be getting kills most of the time, so he will stack the Blackcliff buff. So Blackcliff Warbow, a very, very good choice. The compound bow is a bow you can craft, but unfortunately it isn't for Childe. Bad base attack, it gives a physical damage bonus which Childe can't really use, and while its effect is nice and fits Childe, again, the other parts of the bow just don't fit at all. Favonius Warbow, not really for Childe, especially a main DPS Childe. Maybe for your, again, burst DPS, but there are better options than the Favonius Warbow for that, for that type of gameplay. The prototype Crescent is very good. Good base attack, it gives attack percent, and then its effect is nice. So with its effect, you need to hit a weak spot with a charged bow attack. So what you can do is switch to Childe, hit a charged attack, get the buff, and then switch to your melee stance. So prototype Crescent, a very good weapon that is craftable as well. So it's sort of it's the complete free-to-play bow. So again, and it's a good bow in general for any sort of Childe playstyle. Rust. Oh baby, Rust. Rust is definitely the best weapon for Childe out of the gacha weapons. I mean, it is crazy. So what does Rust do? It has okay base attack, it gives an attack percent, very welcome for Childe, and then its effect increases your normal attack damage by 40%. And that is massive, especially if you get Rust. If you get some refinements on Rust, the damage you'll be dealing while just hitting on your melee stance is absurd, and it fits Childe perfectly. And even the loss of that 10% damage on your charged attacks, I mean, you're still gonna be charged attacking on melee form, and you won't be losing that much DPS. It's not that big of a loss of DPS compared to the crazy amount of damage you'll be dealing with your normal attack. So yeah, Rust is definitely his best in slot out of the gacha weapons. The sacrificial bow, while some people think it will work, no, the sacrificial bow unfortunately does not reset Childe's cooldown when he switches off of his melee stance, so it doesn't work, and it gives energy recharge, so it's not for Childe. Viridescent Hunt, very good weapon for Childe if you have it. Okay base attack, it gives crit rate, so helps you balance your crit rate and crit damage, and then its effect has this sort of like cyclone that pulls in enemies, so it is very much useful to group up enemies and deal damage to them easily using Riptide and Childe's normal attacks. So yeah, Viridescent Hunt is a very good option, although to be honest, I would go for a high refinement Rust over the Viridescent Hunt. But again, if you're having trouble with artifacts and you need to balance out your crit rate and crit damage, then Viridescent Hunt is of course a very, very good option. Windbloom mode, not really for like Childe. Yes, it gives elemental mastery, its effect is nice, but it doesn't fit Childe that much. The prototype Crescent is a much better option than the Windbloom mode that was free. And then there's the weird official bow. No, it's not for Childe at all. It gives a physical damage bonus and it's not. Then we move on to the bow that is coming within Azuma, the Hama Yumi, as it's called. So you'll be able to craft this 4-star weapon. It has bad base attack though. It does give a lot of attack, and then the effect is very nice. So I don't know if it'll replace the prototype Crescent out of being the best of the craftable weapons for Childe, but it definitely will become a very, very good free-to-play option if your luck in the gacha just isn't that great. There's also the new 5-star bow that we know is coming, and that 5-star bow is gonna become crazy for Childe. I am very, very sure this new bow is gonna be crazy good for Childe. It has amazing base attack, gives a lot of crit damage, and its effect is just perfect for Childe. So it might actually become his best in slot. And talking about 5 stars, well, what 5 stars are available right now? Well, both weapons actually that fit Childe can be acquired through the standard banner, so that's nice. So the 2 bows are the Skyward Harp and the Amos's bow. The Skyward Harp is his best in slot right now. The best base attack out of all the bows, gives crit rate and crit damage through its effect, so it easily helps you balance your crit rate and crit damage even more since it boosts both of them. And its effect that deals that physical damage in an AoE is a nice addition to do some extra damage while you are using your melee stance. And yeah, Skyward Harp is just extremely good. It is his best in slot right now. But the Amos's bow isn't that worse. So, well, compared to a high refinement Rust, not that much. But refinement 1 and refinement 1, the Amos's bow isn't bad, because it has good base attack, it gives you attack percent, and then it does increase your normal and charge attack damage. You are losing that other effect where, it's like a normal charge attack, the more it's in the air, the more the shot is in the air, it deals more damage, You're not using that, but it's still nice that you're getting a normal and charge attack damage bonus from the bow. So yeah, Amos's bow, very good, very good. Skyward Harp is better, but again, and Amos's bow isn't that good compared to a high refinement Rust, but if both are R1, I would use the bow, the Amos bow, the 5-star of course. But I can't wait for that 5-star Thundering Pulse to hit and see how crazy it makes Childe. Like, oof, I can't wait. So yeah, that is it for Childe. He's my favorite character. In conclusion, I love him. I saved up my wishes for him, and not even 5 days after I got Childe from the banner that he was on, the rerun, I got a Skyward Harp from the standard banner, and I was really happy. And since then, he has become my absolute favorite character. I seriously love his unique playstyle. I love shredding enemies that are closely bundled up together. I love switching from range to melee if I need to, stun a ruin card and then charge in with my normal attacks in melee stance and destroy them. And he's so fun to play. If there is one type or one character that people main, and how people are like, oh, Diluc mains are bad people or anything, I can easily say that Childe mains are very nice people. They are very happy, they know what they're doing, and they're very helpful, I guess. They're just, we are all nice. Childe mains, you know what I'm talking about. So yeah, that is it for Childe. And yeah, our next character then, well, he's going, it's Diluc actually, so we're gonna be taking a look at Diluc next. I'll see you then.